Miles A. Drake, The Flesh Tithe. Saigera's sky was screaming. The sonic onslaught of the Xenos vessels cutting through it sent palpable shockwaves through the narrow streets and across the wide plaza outside. Sister Lucia ducked under the arched doorway of the small cathedral she now protected, the convent of St. Cybele, as another sickle-shaped aircraft shrieked overhead in an erratic arc. She gritted her teeth as the debilitating vibration wrecked her nerves and cut into her mind. And then it was gone. Gripping the enameled chasing of her bolt gun, she let it provide her measure of strength as she recovered from the oral assault. Shaking off the pain, she strode down the steps of the ruined place of worship into the city square before it. The hymn of Saint Cybele echoing from the Covenant's last remaining external Lord Hailed drifted away, as did the sobbing murmur of the dozens terrified citizens within. Hell had come to Saigera, descending upon her city, Moldavar with a deluge of nightmares that strained her, even her considerable resolve. What was once a city of serenity and devotion was now a slaughterhouse on a scale that defied reason. The atmosphere wailed as the alien sicklecraft cut through it again and again. The streets echoed with screams as the city's inhabitants fell prey to the things that stalked through the dilapidated alleys. She had yet to see the enemy, but Lucia knew they were near, and knew they would come. She did not know why they hadn't mounted a ground offense. Perhaps the convent, with its 8 battle-sisters called to war on distant Irexes, was not considered a threat. Or perhaps it had something to do with the seemingly erratic nature of the onslaught. In the initial hours of the attack, the invaders had struck strategic areas, but since then, the strafing attacks had been random and downright wanton. The crackling, distorted Vox reports that still had managed to filter through the horrendous static said the same thing about the enemies on the ground. The frantic Vox chatter had been arbitrarily moving packs of clawed scarecrow-like Xenos horrors. With Moldavar's panicked communications having fallen silent, replaced by eerie white noise, Sister Lucia could not guess at what had happened to the outlying mountain settlements. She could only pray that the farther, more isolated townships and hamlets had remained untouched. It had all begun just before dawn, although that seemed like an eternity ago. The reassuring silhouettes of Saigera's meagre garrison fleet had simply come apart in flashes of painfully bright green light. Crisscrossing smoke trails of falling orbital wreckage had become a permanent stain on the frigid sky, raining down throughout the day and well into the evening. Now, new constellations of ominous crescent shapes were becoming visible in the upper atmosphere, shimmering like floating apparitions in the haze of the dying sunlight. Lucia ached from old wounds sustained years ago, but her powered armor alleviated her steps as she reached the makeshift barricade surrounding the entrance of what remained of the convent. Her ornate black and white armor was coated in a layer of grey dust from the collapsed structure of the convent's lone steeple. One of these Xeno flyers had atomized its lower structure of an arc of blinding emerald not 3 hours ago, and the image of that jagged flux of the energy still burned in her retinas. Her black Soleil-like helmet was buckled to her belt, revealing her weathered, statuesque features and jaw-length white hair. A black chalice tattoo adorned her cheek, with 3 parallel claw-mark scars marred her face from forehead to jaw, courtesy one of the many Torguns she'd slain years before. Another craft sighed over the plaza, its keening wail staggering the sister. Tasting the tang of blood in her mouth as it ran from her nose, she gripped her bolt gun with such determination that her gauntlets scraped lines into its chasing. And then the noise was gone. She continued limping towards the barricades, her nerves still on edge. The aerial doors between Saigera's Aeronautica defenders and the nightmarish invaders were long done, and the smoke from the downed lightnings and thunderbolts dotted the city like smouldering funeral pyres. Still, the invaders flew, cutting through the skies with neither rhyme nor reason, hunting prey that was long gone. By the time the soldiers by the makeshift barricades had recovered from the sonic onslaught, she was amongst them. Lieutenant Perrin and his remaining men were hauling wreckage from the surrounding rubble to the barricade, but progress was slow. The constant shrieking had already caused several of Lucia's assembled band of battered survivors to fall in fits of madness that she could do little to calm, despite her years of Medicaid experience. Some had fled screaming into the alleys converging upon the plaza. Others had been escorted into the convent, where the soothing hymnals echoing softly from the Lord Hailers might do their work. "Sister," the lieutenant began when he finally noticed her, his voice weak and clearly shaken. "The barricades are up." His eyes were baggy and dark, his hair rugged under his mauve shako. He and his men wore dust-coated fatigues in mauve and imperial gold, but were such tattered remnants of their former finery. Lucia nodded her assent, the steel strong in her voice. "Good. Any luck with the signal?" Perrin shook his head, his ashen face turning towards the Voxman who had been attempting to raise the militia command and the adeptas at Beatty's precinct since the arrival on the convent. They hoped to learn if there was any sort of coordinated defense still in place. Dead static and silence left little hope. "No way they could have held out," the Voxman muttered to his officer. "Told you, it's no use. The damn static is everywhere, on every bloody frequency." The lieutenant bowed his head, resigned, but Sister Lucia would have none of it. "Keep trying," she ordered, her voice stern and commanding. Perhaps the task was futile, but the men needed something to do, and mind without purpose wandered in dark places, especially now. "Start searching for other signals, survivors, isolated resistance pockets. If command is down, then perhaps we can bring other survivors here, and find a way to get through the static. Try every channel you can get access to." They had brought the static. It was some kind of jamming signal, Lucia assumed, as it would crippled Vox communications and automated cognition systems, shutting down Moldovar's defense grid before the enemy had even landed. The man saluted and Lucia glared at Perrin. "Do not lose focus," she commanded. "Until we draw our last breaths, we must deny the Xenos in whatever way we can. The Emperor is watching, and he disapproves of defeatism and resignation." She strode off to continue her inspection of the barricades, leaving the soldiers to their task. The soft padding of her feet behind her made her turn around. It was Sarah. "I told you to stay indoors," Lucia scolded. Sarah was one of the many orphans that had come to St. Sibel's for shelter, and Lucia had witnessed her grow from a girl to a young woman. While the other battle sisters had disapproved of the orphans being allowed in the convent, Lucia had overruled them and made a personal mission to keep at least some in the city's street urchins from the underworld that so many fell to. Now, it seemed, Sarah was the only one left. While Lucia would not allow sorrow at that fact to weaken her, she did admit she felt it. "But," Sarah began, brushing some strands of her ash-blonde hair from her eyes, "Callan is shouting again. He says he only hears the noise from the Lord Hailers. But they're not making the static. They're still singing the hymnals. I think he's going mad." Lucia sighed. "He might be. The faithless lack the resolve that the God Emperor's devoted. Their minds are always the first to break." She'd known Callan through Sarah, a purveyor of illicit narcotic substances. A sinner, many of the street children of Moldovar had been his runners. Lucia had kept Sarah clear. "If he becomes a danger to others, warn me," Sarah continued, following Lucia along the barricades. "I don't want to listen to him. He's making me feel sick. I'd rather be out here. I want to help." Lucia shot the girl a stern glare. "No, go back inside. I guarantee you the noise out here is more unbearable than whatever Callan is spewing. Have faith. Remember what Deacon Ovelo taught you." Sarah nodded and retreated back inside, much to Lucia's relief. The girl had barely made it back into the Covenant before Lucia's words proved true. 3 Xeno vessels shrieked overhead in rapid successions, buckling everyone around the barricades. Wiping more blood from her face, Lucia forced the agony away and remained standing, so that the others might take inspiration from her fortitude. What horror had the damnable ghoul stars spat at them this time, she had wondered. She had already endured 6 long years in the steaming jungles of Tithe, with the other hospitaliers of her order providing triage near and on the front lines, as well as fighting to defend those in her care from the marauding packs of Tagoran bloodreeks that had infested the world. That had been 5 years ago. Since then, peace, calm, and contemplation of the ecclesiarchy's holy teachings had been much of her life, with her position as the Covenant's caretaker and guardian. A couple of desperate shouts brought Lucia's gaze to the right, to the entrance of one of the radial alleyways. The chattering of stub-gun fire accompanied the calls of anguish echoing from between the dilapidated structures. "Survivors!" the sentry watching the alley shouted, unslinging his laser carbine. Lucia, Perrin, and the others ran to the sentry, crouching down into cover behind the barricades there. She saw a dozen of city folk rounding the bend some 30 meters down the alley. They were shouting in terror as they sprinted towards the Covenant. At the rear of the rabble, 3 militiamen were firing stub guns at targets Lucia could not yet see, and a man in black RBT's enforcer's plate wheeled around to fire a quick burst from his shotgun before turning to catch up with the rest of them. Lucia sighted down her bolter and levelled it just over the heads of the oncoming throng. And then she saw them. 2 huge figures rounded the bend, gaunt, cadaverous things, standing half again as tall as a man, even though their stature was hunched. Their long gangling limbs ended in razor talons, and an emerald light shone from hollow eye sockets. As they stalked forward, she felt the urge to fire pass around her with a palpable ripple. Seeing fingers squeeze on triggers and skin blanch at the nightmarish creatures stalking towards them, she would have given the order to shoot were it not for the fleeing people in the way. "Hold your fire!" she called, knowing that it would allow the creatures to close on the barricade. Perrin shouted, his voice edging on panic. "But sister, they—" "Hold!" Lucia shouted again, putting fury in her voice. They did. The terrified group struggled over the rubble, almost at Lucia's barricade, with the creatures in close pursuit. Lucia saw that the towering frames were completely skeletal metallic, and they were clad in ragged tatters of some kind. She remembered Dialogus' teachings back in her tenure with the Schola Progenium, which spoke of fleshless abominations of ancient metal whose tombs lurked hidden on many worlds. From what little she'd learned, they'd seem more like some kind of nightmare legend than actual fact. Clearly, that notion was wrong. An old man lagging behind the throng fell in the uneven footing of the rubble. He shouted something inaudible over the terrified cries of his compatriots and tried to rise just as one of the Xenos made it to him. It descended upon him, its talons flaying ribbons of flesh from him with each lightning-fast stroke, all the while howling a discordant white noise. Energy crackled through the blades, the creature cutting through clothing, flesh and bone with unnerving fluidity, instantaneously vivisecting its screaming victim and transferring his flesh to its own emaciated form. She then saw the tatters the Xenos wore for what they truly were: flesh, sinew, skin. "God, Emperor, protect us," she whispered, and it took considerable willpower to not fire. She saw the desperate glances of the soldiers look into her for confirmation. How she wanted to indulge them. It had been half a decade since she'd seen combat, and the heated adrenaline of it surged through her. She felt the thunder of her heart and the pumping of blood through her limbs. The pressure of each pulse felt as though it would just be enough to squeeze her finger, that fraction necessary to pull the trigger. As the first of the panicked survivors made it to the barricade, she shouted for them to run to the Covenant before the last of them made it. As soon as she had the clear angle on the closest of the horrors, not 20 paces away, she fired. Her shell hit the Xeno squarely in its armoured ribcage, which dented under the explosive force. 4 more of her bolter shells nearly blew off one of its arms and shattered a portion of its skulls, pulping the fleshy remnants of the human viscera coiled around its neck. Before Lucia could shout the order to open fire, Perrin and his men had already added the liar's fire to her volley. They managed little more than to burn holes through the Xeno's tattered vestment and scorch its exoskeleton black. Still it came. The low thud of an Arbiti's shotgun joined the chatter of gunfire, and she saw the burly black-clad enforcer take up position alongside her, and then reach them. Shattering through the barricade with its momentum and metal bulk, it descended upon 2 of Perrin's men, cutting both of them down with a single swipe of its right claw. It wheeled around, backhanding Perrin with its left talon. He crashed back into the barrier, his chest cavity a mangled ruin. It moved down the barricade without pause, straight towards Lucia and the enforcer. Backpedaling, she fired off the remainder of her clip. The shells pulverized what remained of the creature's torso, and finally sent it spark into the ground, its ribcage a metal wreckage, draped in human gore. She was about to yell something when the other Xenos reached them, striding into several more of Perrin's men. They turned to flee, but it was too late, and the creature waded through 6 of them, each swipe of its talons accompanied by arterial sprays, crackling hisses, and gurgling death screams. Lucia reloaded, slammed the second of her 4 sickle clips into the breech, and put another series of rounds into the creature as it turns towards her. She dimly saw the enforcer flank to her left as it charged. Drawing her chainsaw in one swift action, she thumbed the activation stud, revving it to life, though she knew it would be too late. A moment before the Xenos hit her, the deafening crump and pressure burst of a crack grenade dazed Lucia, staggering her back. She heard the muffled sound of shooting and saw the enforcer firing a shotgun, the pin of a grenade still between his teeth. By the time she shook off the force of the impact, it was already staggering back. The enforcer's onslaught toppled the Xenos over the remnants of the barricade, and it fell into the back amidst the rubble. As it began to rise again, Lucia seized the opportunity. Dropping her bolter, she let loose a war cry, barely hearing her own voice, and charged headlong onto the thing, her chainsaw held in both hands. Leaping over the rubble and landing onto the fallen abomination, she angled her blade down to thrust into its ribcage. Her chainsaw's adamantium teeth howled in protest as she put all of her strength and rage into the weight of the blade. The thing hissed and clawed at her, rending deep grooves into the armor on her thighs and waist, and shredding her ceremonial tabard. Thankfully, the plating held true, and the bruising force of the impacts were all that strikes accomplished. "Abomination!" she roared, and the chainsaw finally sheared through it. The screeching of breaking teeth and flensing metal joined the dead static howl until, finally, the light in the thing's eye socket died, and it ceased its convulsions. After a few moments, she relented, pulling her now ruined chainsword from the wreckage of the Xenos. She'd need to retrieve a new one from the Covenant's armory. The enforcer was just behind her, his helmet removed to reveal a battered, square-jawed face and a shaved head. He nodded at her. "Decent work, sister." She barely heard him. She didn't need to require his acknowledgement. Her eyes glazed over from the flood of adrenaline. Rigorous training regiments aside, she hadn't felt the fury of battle for many years. Lucia took a few deep breaths to calm herself. Blessed are the righteous who take up his holy sword. Blessed are the crusaders who challenge his fated foes. Blessed are the victors who vanquished the unclean and the damned. She looked over the scene, seeing 9 dead, including Lieutenant Perrin. Their eviscerated forms lay splattered across the rubble. The thought that Perrin and his men might have lived if she'd given the order to fire before it was almost too late swarmed through her mind, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt or guilt. How many of the survivors would have been caught in the crossfire if they had shot sooner? Perrin and his men were local militia. It was their duty to fight and, if necessary, die to protect the Imperium and its citizens, a duty they had fulfilled. Blessed are the fallen who perish in his name, for they will walk at the Emperor's side. She finished her prayer as the enforcer began salvaging what he could from the remains. The surviving men of Perrin's platoon looked around in shock, their faces blanched. "Stay steady," she said, the fury within her ebbing and her voice echoing oddly in her battered eardrums. More will come, and we will need every fibre of our Emperor-given resolve. She didn't know if her words inspired them. They would have to steel themselves, and all she could do was to set an example. Get everybody back inside, she told them, mentally taking stock of what they had. With barely a dozen fighting men inside a half-wrecked Covenant, the chances seemed grim. But the arms and armour of the dead could be salvaged and distributed among the 30 or so survivors that hid within. Surely some would fight. In the face of mankind's hated foes they would have to. Or they would die. And distribute the weapons to those who can use them, she added. We'll need every able-bodied soul to defend the place tonight. She turned to the Arbites enforcer, who stood over one of the fallen abominations, prodding at it with his iron-shod boot. Not so easy to kill, are they? He stated, more than asked, as Lucia approached him. No, she agreed, but zeal and fury can destroy any of the Emperor's foes. He gave half glance at the weapon she clutched. The bolter probably helps. Lucia glared at him. He shrugged, glancing out across the darkening alleys. Raoul, he said, with no explanation. As Lucia cocked her head, he thumped his matte black breastplate. Enforcer Raoul, last of the precinct Tertius, probably. Lucia made a sign of the Aquila. I am Sister Lucia, Hospitalier of the Order of Ebon Chalice, caretaker in a Covenant of Saint Cybele. The rest of your sisters? Gone, the Hospitalier returned. To Ixus to protect the pilgrim roads from the Torrigan bloodreeks. Raoul shook his head. Fragging bloodreeks. They never stop, do they? A shame. Could have used them here. Indeed, Lucia agreed. But all of Emperor's holy work is of paramount importance. I was left behind to protect this covenant. There aren't any by chance any more sisters of your order planetside? None, regrettably. All of the military covenants were dispatched to Ixus after the latest bloodreek incursion. Well, the enforcer mused, the shadow of smile forming on his face. Then we're on our own. He turned away from the sister, gesturing towards the blood-stained, debris-ridden plaza. I'll keep watch and see what I can do about cleaning up the mess. Lucia made the sign of the Aquila again. No, we are never alone. The Emperor watches, and he protects. With that, she moved to administer last rites to the fallen. An hour later, last rays of Saigira's daylight raked the cold, smoky atmosphere. As night fell, a dismal darkness engulfed the city. The chatter of distant gunfire and the fading cries were the lonely dirges to which they waited. The loud hailers had died with the Covenant's reserve generators. Inside, the Covenant remained dimly lit by candles and torches, but other than that, with power cut to the city, the darkness was absolute. Xeno aircraft periodically shrieked through the skies, but their frequency had lessened, to everyone's relief. Several more throngs of survivors emerged from dark alleys to seek refuge in the chapel. They were bewildered, exhausted, and horrified, and Lucia directed them inside, while the remaining militia and Raoul kept vigilant order on the barricade. A fair number of the arrivals came armed, either as survivors or soldiers, and joined the ragged band of protectors outside. The tales told by the survivors were all the same, of sheer horror. The Xenos' abominations were spread throughout the city, stalking the streets, hunting for their human prey. Lucia heard of only small packs, never more than 5, never less than 2. The enforcer reluctantly mentioned that over 200 of them had swarmed the precinct with the seemingly random support of their marauding aircraft. Pacing along the barricades, exhaustion began to chew at the survivors. What little recap had remained had already been distributed among the militia and the enforcer. Lucia kept herself awake by sheer force of will and regular prayers, muttered under her breath. She applied her hospitalier's trade to the wounded. With the Xenos' onslaught and weaponry, it became evident they had left few victims alive. Such was their lethality. All the while, she watched the dark alleys for any signs of further survivors, or the horrors that were certainly out there. Several times, alarm was called by sentries at sightings of monstrous scarecrow figures standing motionlessly in alleyways before fading into the gloom again. Each alarm spurred a wave of panic and bustle of activity as men and women moved to meet the phantom threat. Each alarm amounted to nothing, save for the clawing sense that they were out there, watching, waiting. The dead of the night brought the flashing lights of void battle. Crisscrossing arcs of blooms and emerald, orange, yellow, and blue energy lit up the sky. A ship that had remained hidden. Or reinforcements? Lucia didn't know. She saw many of the folk within the Covenant peering out of its shattered windows to watch, their eyes wide with wonder at the sights above, and glimmering with hope. Some of the braver, or more foolhardy, refugees came out to the steps of the Covenant for a better view. The sister thought of leading the survivors in for a hymn of salvation, but in the end decided against it. With the rapidity that Saigeri's garrison fleet had been disassembled in orbit, she hardly expected a positive outcome from whatever this engagement was. But she did not wish to fan the flames of hope, knowing they could gutter out in but a moment. Half an hour passed before a new star blossomed in the sky, and Lucia knew it the plasma core detonation of whatever warship had offered its resistance. She closed her eyes, offering a prayer for the souls of those on board. As she did so, the hopeful whispers of the survivors turned to gasps of shock and then to murmurs of despair. Bidding them to return indoors, she was forced to usher some of the more shaken back inside before returning to the line. "As I said, we're on our own now," Raoul muttered to her back at the barricade. There was no fear in his voice, nor care. Lucia did not respond, but stared out into the darkness, removing her bolter from its maglock. The Xeno's talons had marred its chasing, but she knew it was still functional. She had refilled her magazines, clamping several more of clips of blessed shells to her belt from the chapel's armory. With little access to las or stub ammunition, she knew the situation for the others was probably even worse. "If we are alone, then we die here, on hallowed ground," she said, quietly enough for only Raoul to hear. "And we take as many of the unholy abominations with us as we can." He cocked his head, the curl of a smile forming on his lips. "So be it." Almost an hour later, the pitch in the distant symphony of noises echoing throughout the city intensified, growing louder as it drew nearer. Rising to kneel behind a blood-matted barricade, she listened to the reverberating dirge of screams and staccato of chattering gunfire. She pushed the noise to the back of her mind and forced herself to focus through the growing fatigue. "Vigilance," she told herself. Her body ached from her old wounds. She closed her eyes. Tithe had been bad. The line had pushed back into the war camp on so many occasions that even she, ordinarily kept from the front, had fought enough to be considered something of a veteran. Those 6 years on Tithe had been terror. Facing the grotesque Tolgarans had been a living nightmare, but at least the enemy still had a clear strategy and could be killed by one placed bolter shell. These Xenos were something else entirely. Smoke obscured Saigera's moons, and the gloom was darker than it had been on any other night. Thanks to the loss of power, the sightings were becoming more and more frequent, with alarm being called every 10 minutes or so. It was nerve-wracking, knowing they were so near, yet waiting. Lucia's tenacity kept her calm. She knew that most of the others looked to her. If she faltered, their spirits would break. And so she would not falter. The wreckage of the 2 Xenos lay amidst the macabre carpet of the army they had slaughtered. Most of the human bodies had been moved and placed under the tarps, but much of the mess still remained. On several occasions, Lucia thought she saw the chrome remnants of those Xenos stir, a twitch of a razor claw, or a sickly glow in the hollow eye sockets. She attributed the glint of light reflected in its eye, or the emerald retinal flare that still marred in her vision. Lucia scowled as she saw Sarah approaching the barricade. "What did I tell you?" "I want to help," the girl protested. Somehow she'd found an ornately chased auto-pistol, which she was clutching tightly. Lucia saw both fear and eagerness in her green eyes. She took the pistol away from the girl nonetheless. "Where did you get that?" "I got it from Callan. He had it in his bag." Sarah explained. Lucia sighed. Naturally. Now get back inside. You are not a soldier. Sarah glanced defiantly towards the militia manning the barricades. Neither are they. There aren't any soldiers anymore. Just people that don't want to wait and die. I want to help. I know how to shoot a gun and know how to reload it, and I don't want to wait for those things to kill me. I'd rather die fighting. Lucia almost turned away. Even if Sarah's words had truth to them, she could not deny. But then she saw the fire in the girl's eyes. Please, Sarah pleaded. Otherwise I'll grab rocks and throw them if they come again. Lucia sighed again, resigned. She placed the auto pistol back into Sarah's hands and gave her a stern glare. Fine, but do not fire until I fire, and if I or the enforcer give an order, you will follow it. If I tell you to run, you run. Do you understand? Sarah nodded eagerly. Yes, I understand. Very well, Lucia agreed. Then stay on the steps of the Covenant. If they come, get behind the barricades and do as I say. And with that, Lucia returned to what remained of the makeshift wall to continue her vigil. The sister jolted from her reverie as the keening wail of one of the invaders' aircraft sighed overhead, skimming the rooftops. It was the first in hours. She had gritted her teeth and scrunched her eyes shut in agony as the sudden sound cut through every fibre of her being. As she recovered, she heard others shouting. "Sister," Raoul called, pointing down the alley near his section of the line. "I think they're coming." Hearing the distant screaming and gunfire echoing nearer, she readied her bolt gun and saw 3 huge skeletal shapes shambling towards Raoul Day's line. One of the dead Xenos lying out beyond her barricade was rising as well, draped in this tattered mockery of human flesh. She saw the gouge inflicted by her chainsaw earlier was all but mended, and she cursed whatever vile sorcery allowed these things to repair themselves. Lucia blinked twice to make sure she wasn't hallucinating, and upon seeing the rest of the defenders, Raoul aside gawking in horror at the rising abomination, she shouted a war cry. "Purge the Xenos! If they rise again, we shall slay them again!" Sighting down her bolt gun, she fired a controlled burst at the creature as it started shambling towards her. The rattle of militia stub guns joined her bolter's fury, and the thing's metallic exoskeleton deformed, jolting back from the impacts. It kept coming. It howled dead static, and Lucia gritted her teeth, firing again and again. It would have to get through her to get to the people she'd sworn to protect. She would see that it never made it that far. It fell a second time, and she glanced around, noticing the tide of people running from the 2 other alleys towards the Covenant. Dozens of survivors and fighters just paces ahead of yet more of the Xenos. They loped forward, their ragged shrouds of human viscera glistening in the baleful moonlight as much as their half-meter-long talons and their hollow emerald eye sockets. That was it, she thought. This was how it ended. Her heart thundered, and the surging adrenaline heightened her senses to deadly focus of raging battle. She turned and fired at the Xenos descending upon the enforcer's line. His shotgun blasts were staggering them back, and he lobbed his remaining crack grenade into them, toppling the first. Another almost fell to the combined fire of a dozen stubbers, jolting back several times, its skeletal armor pockmarked by hundreds of indentations, but it was Lucia's fire that shattered its skull. The last reached them, knocking the enforcer aside with a backhand and shredding their militia while Lucia reloaded, disemboweling men and women as they tried to run. It wasn't until Raoul rose and unleashed a point-blank volley that it finally fell. The mass of fleeing men, women and children pouring through the alley had now reached the barricade on the other side of Lucia, and she wheeled around, and even as she noticed the second of the fallen Xenos on Raoul's barricade rising again, they would have to deal with it on their own. To her frustration, most of the militia were already firing. She took some satisfaction to see Sarah, to her side, holding fire, waiting for Lucia's order. The bullets cut through the last of the approaching crowd in an attempt to stop the 3 Xenos in closer pursuit. Shaking her head in disgust and rage, Lucia fired over the head of a screaming woman, knocking back the scarecrow abomination about to cut her down, but not before the woman fell to the indiscriminate gunfire of the militia. With the militia, Sarah included, firing with full abandon, the relentless hail of stub bullets and crackling las fire put one of the Xenos down, while Lucia's bolter was focused elsewhere. Lucia fired a controlled burst at another, blasting its skeletal limbs from its body in quick succession. A third Xenos vaulted the barricade close by and disemboweled 2 of the militia with a single sweep of its claw. It wheeled towards Sarah, who shrieked in terror and stumbled away, drenched in the gore of the 2 men that had stood beside her. Lucia shouted to get its attention, shooting in it back. Sparks flew and it spun around in an instant, lashing its other talon with startling speed. She leaped back, feeling the hissing blade narrowly miss her. It moved after her, and Lucia fired her remaining ammunition at point-blank range, knocking it back to create distance. Dropping her empty bolter and dragging her damaged chainsaw, she lunged towards it as it staggered. With a desperate battle cry, she delivered a series of wild swings, the chainsaw rattling as it revved. There was no precision nor finesse to her attacks, just the brute force of a desperate survival instinct and zeal-fueled rage. Her onslaught drove it back. Even as it lashed at her, its claws scraping across her side, she felt one of the blades punched through her armor, across her lower ribs. Screaming, she took the chain blade in both hands and brought it sideways in a wide arc across its thorax, hacking through its metallic spinal column. It fell in 2, and Lucia staggered back, the agony of the wound, however vestigial, momentarily overwhelming her. The Xenos crawled towards her, dragging its severed torso across the blood-slick cobbles. Seeing it stagger a few more times as the militia put fire into it, she kicked out savagely before bringing her chainsaw in a downward arc. She bludgeoned it down and lunged forward to kick it again in the skull, stamping again and again until it ceased its spasmodic jolting. Lucia wanted nothing more than to step back and take a momentary breath, but it was not over. The thunder of adrenaline pulsed through her like an unstoppable tide. She surged for Sarah, but could not see her. She saw Raoul finish the remaining creature with repeated slams of his shock maul, even as 2 more of them emerged from the alley behind him. "Behind you!" she shouted, her voice hoarse. He wheeled around and then fired at the last of his ammunition. She would have rushed to his aid were it not for the trio of cadaverous giants erupting from the gloom near her to her own position, and the rising form of one of the fallen ones outside the barricade. Attempting to vault over the low barricade in the direction of the rising Xenos, she stumbled at it, delivering the same savagery towards it until it ceased moving. The warning shouts of the militia behind her and a huge howl of White Nose prompted her to wheel around. Another nightmare, in full charge, slammed into her and flung her back nearly 5 meters with a backhand. She landed hard, her armor absorbing their impact. Noticing that her armor was cleaved open over her midriff, she struggled to her knees, biting back the pain. Thankfully, the electrical crackle of the Xenos' talons seemed to have cauterized the wound. She dimly noted a roaring sound from somewhere else, but ignored it as the Xenos closed the distance toward her with its stalking gait. Disarmed, she raised her gauntleted right hand, extending it, and revving up the small bonesaw in her Medicaid gauntlet as a last attempt to ward off his killing strike. And then it died. Incandescent blue plasma fire engulfed the creature. The flash burned her retinas, momentarily blinding her and leaving yet another searing afterimage in her blinking eyes. The blazing husk of the Xenos was crushed under the immense black-armored bulk of the giant that landed upon it. Letting out a ragged gasp, Lucia rose to her feet and saw the carnage unfold around her. 5 towering shapes of hulking Ceramites were among the human defenders. 5 of the Emperor's Angels of Death. They wore massive jump packs on their backs, their thrusters still glowing a vivid, infernal orange. She hadn't seen them arrive, and gasped, gawking at their sudden presence. Dazed from the pain, Lucia could do little other than watch them finish off the remaining Xenos. Though the abominations were just as tall as the massive forms of the armoured Space Marines, the transhuman giants defeated them quickly enough, ending them with precise shots of their bolt pistols and quick slashes of their chainswords. She watched the Space Marine struggle with one of the Xenos, locked in a deadly grapple as he repeatedly bashed it back with the pommel of the chainsaw before shooting it 3 times in the torso, blowing it apart. The other 4 moved about the plaza, their chainswords dismembering down Xenos to prevent them from rising again. Their jet-black ceramite plate clashed with their ghost-white corvid helms, and when Lucia saw the sinister heraldry of jewelers' skulls on their crossed scythes, emblazoning their right pauldrons, she recognized them for what they were. All around, men and women staggered about. Lucia found Sarah lying amidst a slick pile of crimson in the midst of 3 eviscerated corpses, and felt a brief moment of heart-stopping panic as she thought the girl was dead. But Sarah rose to her feet, terror in her eyes, clutching the auto-pistol in both hands, and repeatedly squeezed the trigger on her empty weapon at the fallen Xenos. "Calm now," Lucia gasped, putting a hand on Sarah's shoulder, accidentally putting far more weight on it than she had intended, as the girl almost buckled. "It's over. The Emperor's angels have come." It was only then that Sarah seemed to notice the Space Marines, and her eyes widened even further. For a brief instant, Lucia thought she saw hope. It rapidly turned to dread as one of the Space Marines advanced towards them. In his left hand, he clutched a bulky plasma pistol, its cooling coils glowing a searing, hissing indigo. In his right, he clutched a blue, crackling power axe, the open, mandibled skull of a Togan blockdreak worked over the top of the weapon's narrow, wedge-like blade. While there was nothing overtly threatening about his motions, the sheer size of the warrior and the sinister air around him made her involuntarily step back and sent Sarah skittering towards off the Covenant doors. After a moment, he maglocked his weapons to his belt. "Survivors," the giant spoke. His voice was deep, dull crackle of a distant thunderstorm. "Intriguing." Lucia did not know how to respond. She'd encountered Space Marines before. She'd seen the Nova Marines in their quartered blue and white warplate on Tissaris, and she'd seen the others in the heraldry of those before her prior to the Imperial counterattack on the Emperor-forsaken world. But she'd never see them this close. "Death Spectres," she whispered, still in shock. "Yes. Sergeant Nivicarian, 7th Squad, 8th Company," the Space Marines responded. "Thank you," Lucia said, her voice still somehow muffled. "Your timing is divine. The Xenos almost had us overrun." "Yes," he said, turning to survey the area. "Almost." The sergeant muttered a series of sub-vocal vox orders, and the other Space Marines acknowledged, with clicks of their helmets' vox grills. The momentary calm was broken by the roar of one of the Space Marines' jump pack. As he rocketed onto the roof of the Covenant, he landed upon a vantage point of its shattered steeple, dislodging shingles and debris as he gained footing. The others spread out to secure the alleys converging on the plaza. There was a brief pause as the sergeant listened to the reports of his warriors, all the while affixing her with his unblinking, lifeless gaze. Lucia had so many questions, and Nevacarian seemed to read that. "Our strike cruiser, Somnium Nihilo, was silenced in orbit," he said flatly, and Lucia realized just how hopeless their situation was. She understood now how the enemy was so quickly able to dispatch the garrison fleet overhead. If they could destroy a Space Marine strike cruiser, then there would be little else to stop them from razing or reaving the rest of the city, or the world. "We made our escape via Thunderhawk, but were shot down by the enemy interceptors. We were swept out of the hold." "And then you landed here," Lucia finished, finally understanding where the Space Marines had descended from. "Correct. How many survivors are there inside?" 30. 40 perhaps, no more," Lucia replied with uncertainty. The Space Marine made another sub-vocal vox communication to his warriors. After a few moments he spoke. "We can bring you and your survivors to potential safety." Lucia looked up in surprise. "Our Thunderhawk is down, but status reads as still being intact. Our Tech Marine was able to guide it safely to the ground." Lucia nodded, taken aback at Nevacarian's sudden offer. Would the enemy vessels not simply shoot you down again? "Negative. The enemy craft have mostly returned to orbit to hunt the savior pods and escape craft from the destroyed fleet," he growled. "And where would we go? If there was any way off-world, then escape from the city seemed only a temporary solution." The outskirts of Sagira, the sergeant responded. We have documented the aftermaths of similar Xeno incursions, and it would only appear that they devote most of their attentions to densely populated urban centres, not outlying regions. Lucia affirmed as another wave of pain washed over her. She couldn't guess as to why the Xeno invaders would leave the countryside untouched. Given your position in Order's militant, I assume you have some knowledge of the enemy, the sergeant continued. Rumours only. Distant reports of distant worlds from some buried, re-emerging threat. Necrons, Nevercarian confirmed, and Lucia mouthed the foul word in disgust. An ancient enemy, calculating, insidious, and highly technologically advanced. The Space Marine paused. Except for this particular case, these Necrons are of the Bone Kingdom of Drazak, and immense, forsaken to damnation and madness, even by the standards of their own kind. And, as you have likely noted, there is little logical calculation into their behaviour. Lucia finally understood the erratic aerial incursions. The Bone Kingdom. A Necron domain hidden deep within the Ghoul stars. Over the last 3 centuries, their forces have emerged, attacking unpredictably into the Halo sectors. How have I never heard of this? Knowledge of such is strictly sanctioned. You know by whom. His answer was clear enough. There are few enough survivors to allow for Mimorek censure. Lucia nodded after a few moments, understanding the need to keep such knowledge hidden for the sake of the general population. Has no one managed to stop them? No. The enemy is gone by the time we can answer any distress calls. Lucia knew the solemn duty of the Space Marines before her. The Death Spectres had been created specifically to watch over the Ghoul stars and prevent its vile inhabitants from splitting forth into the neighbouring sectors. Against the Tagurian Bloodreeks, the twisted Elder Reavers, and the fearsome Chronoids, they had been successful, but not against this threat, it seemed. Upon our arrival, all major population centres have been devoid of life. Only the smallest, isolated settlements are spared the harvest. Harvest? Lucia exclaimed. Yes, we speculate this is what it is. There is no territorial conquest, no supply raid. The Bone Kingdom has use for neither. The only thing it seems to care for is you. When Lucia's eyes betrayed her confusion as the Space Marine's choice of words, he clarified. Humans. More specifically, human remains. They harvest flesh. Lucia trailed off, revolted as she looked over the tattered remnants of the Necrons around them, seeing what they all wore. To them, it is a tithe. Lucia shook her head. There was no knowing the motives of the Xenos, only denying them. She was about to say something when Nevercarian raised his hand. Lucia heard the clicking of Vox transmission coming from his helmet. We will depart for our transport shortly. More Xenos are encroaching upon this area. My warriors and I aim to be underway before they reach the Covenant. If you stay here, you will die. Lucia looked at the cobbles, seeing the blood of those she had fought so hard to save spattered across them. She knew that following the Death Spectres would be risky, dangerous, and that many of her people, the wounded, the infirm, and the elderly, would die. Fighting to the heart of the city might be the end of them all, but the alternative meant certain death. They could not stay. That much was obvious. The sister nodded, resigned to the decision she had to make. Satisfied she'd come to the only possible conclusion, Nevercarian turned and strolled off towards his warriors, leaving Lucia alone for a few moments. Enforcer Raoul strode over to her, apparently having overheard most of the conversation. Glorious, he said, his face deadpan. We all die here if we stay, she stated. That's a fact, Lucia grunted. The enforcer glanced down. And you might want to tend to your own wounds. Lucia looked down and saw 3 clean slashes through her cuirass, just above the hip. They didn't bleed, thankfully. They just smoked lightly. Looking at the wounds made the pain all the fiercer. No, she grimaced, shaking her head. There's no time. And they're quarter roast. She gazed out over the carnage around. Help me gather the rest of the people. They need to be ready to move. He looked at her incredulously. I'm fine, she exclaimed through gritted teeth, pushing away his helping arm, shoving the pain to the back of her mind as best she could. "All right then," he nodded skeptically. "I'll go and assemble who's left." The group of survivors readied themselves as quickly as possible. Lucia found Sarah in the back of the Covenant, using the remaining holy water to wash away some of the gore covering her face and hands. "Come, the Emperor's angels will lead us to salvation." "Salvation?" Sarah stuttered, and Lucia still saw the panic in her eyes. She saw a trauma that might never leave those eyes, and in that moment she thought she felt true sorrow. Sorrow that she had been unable to save the other orphaned children. Guilt that she had allowed the girl onto the front line. These were the emotions she did not have time for. "Yes," Lucia returned, repressing her inner conflict so that her resolve might lend the girl strength. "They have a gunship deeper in the city. They can get us out of Moldovar." Sarah nodded hesitantly, and Lucia guided her to where the refugees were gathering in front of the Covenant, carrying the wounded on stretchers. Lucia and Raoul delivered the same message to the others, and she saw in their eyes that the promise of salvation just barely outweighed the fear of leaving the safety of this holy place. As the Space Marines secured the perimeter, Nevicarian gave a signal, and the exodus of what might well have been Moldovar's last survivors began. The beleaguered refugees struggled to keep up with the remorseless pace of the Space Marines, winding through the labyrinthine alleys of Moldovar's outer Ministeria district. They passed between dilapidated tenements with overhanging balconies fitted with leering gargoyles and tall, arched windows. The windows were long since shattered by sonic onslaught, and the glass shards blanketed the cobbled street, reflecting the pale emerald shapes hovering high in the night sky. Pools of congealed blood welled up in the potholes, seeping from the piles of flailed corpses that were strewn haphazardly through the alleys. Seeing several people falling behind, mostly the wounded and those carrying the stretchers, Lucia begged the Space Marines to slow their pace. They did not, and Lucia began to wonder just how much they truly cared about saving the survivors. 4 of the Death Spectres kept point, with Nevicarian leading. They were faceless in their corvid helms, pistols drawn, overwatching every crossing alley. The other Space Marine moved from rooftop to rooftop, observing from above, and jumping the gaps between their buildings without using his jump pack. Suffering from the pain of her wounds, Sister Lucia kept the center, her words calming the barely suppressed panic with most of the survivors. Raoul led the militia in forming an outer perimeter around the refugees, even if they were nearly as frightened as the people they were trying to protect. The enforcers' icy calm demeanor, the sisters' benedictions, and the transhuman presence of the adeptus Astartes kept the battered band of survivors together. 3 times in the first hour the enemy emerged in ambush. Ear-splitting static wails preceded the sudden rise of pairs or trios of Xenos as they erupted from the piles of dismembered dead of group past. These ambushes ended before Lucia could even act. Twice, the Death Spectres reacted quickly enough, cutting down the rising Xenos before they could assail the group. Once, however, one of the abominations slipped past the Space Marines and scythed into the beleaguered crowd of survivors, hacking 4 to ribbons before being ended by a burst from Nevicarian's plasma pistol. Lucia rallied most of the terrified people, but several fled into dark alleys during the attacks, with Nevicarian and the Space Marines already moving on, ignoring the plight of the refugees. Lucia was forced to leave the dead and the missing behind. It continued that way for several hours, the silence of the dead city pressing in upon them, broken only by bouts of frenzied terror when their nightmares materialized from the macabre ambush points. Lucia lost count of the fallen, but it was well over 20. The Death Spectres seemed to be more focused on conserving the ammunition than stopping the Xenos quickly. Several times, one that could have been shot to pieces before it could reach anybody was allowed to close in and reap its bloody harvest before being put down in melee by the Space Marines. Lucia fought as best as her battered body would allow, putting herself between the Xenos and the refugees, and using her bolter to slow down the loping monsters, outright feeling the occasional one she managed to get a clear angle on. Raoul fought as well, throwing himself into the path of one of the stalking horrors and paying the price for that defiance with a raking wound that sheared clean through his carpet pauldron. The Space Marines never slowed, nor allowed for a pause to treat wounds. They simply kept their relentless pace, uncaring of those they claimed they were protecting. Lucia's mind raced, a growing sense of unease and suspicions falling upon her. If the Space Marines wanted to save them, then why were they letting them die just to conserve ammunition? Why sacrifice them in the interest of time? Leaving Raoul to staunch his own bleeding with a ripped piece of one of her black sleeves, Lucia marched towards Nevercarian. The other 3 Death Spectres had already disappeared around the next bend, and she was determined to get answers. "Why do you not wait for them?" she hissed before realizing exactly what she was doing. The thought alone of making demands of one of the Emperor's Angels of Death might qualify as blasphemy, but that moment, all such care was gone. He turned around, cocking his head to the side, perhaps confused that a mortal would dare challenge him in such a manner. "We must reach our gunship," he stated, his voice a hollow vox crackle. Nevercarian turned away from her to rejoin his warriors, and Lucia felt a sudden flush of anger overcoming her. She moved to block his path, uncaring of how that could end poorly. Much to her surprise, the Death Spectre did not push past her, but stopped. After a few moments of tense silence, he reached up to release the seals of his helmet. It came off with a pneumatic hiss, and she found herself staring into the eyes as black and empty as the starless void. His pupils were so wide they almost entirely engulfed the whites of his eyes. Ghostly pale and hairless, utterly devoid of pigment of any kind, the Space Marine would truly resembled an apparition of death. She fought the ephemeral urge to look away and kept his gaze, the anger boiling in her blood, keeping her courage. The almost human gesture from a warrior that had long abandoned his humanity somehow calmed and humbled her. "You said you can save these people," Lucia stated, looking back over the ever-thinning crowd of people behind her. "I did." He looked away back from her to his men and ordered them to slow their pace before turning back to her. "Walk with me." Lucia did as asked, closing her eyes but for a moment, knowing already what was coming. "You were never here to save us." "I never said we were." "Then why are you here?" she demanded. "You know of us. You know what we were created to do." Her reply was wary. "Yes, you watch over the ghoul stars." "Most knew as much." The Space Marine nodded. "The ghoul stars are immense. We are but one chapter, and most of our companies guard the world deemed by Terror to be of paramount importance. The rest of us are spread thin across the border worlds," Nevercarian explained. "There were 10 of us on board of the Sumner Nahalo, watching over Sagira. 2 died when we were boarded. 3 more died in our descent to the surface. We are all that remain." "How can 10 warriors defend a world against such an invasion?" Lucia responded. She'd never known there were Death Spectres looming above her world, but she was supposed that had been the intent. "We cannot," he said, his voice descending into a spiteful growl. "We were never meant to." Several moments of terrible silence fell upon them, and Lucia felt what little hope that had been sparked by the Space Marine's arrival flicker away. He continued. "This Necron incursion, this tithing fleet, is a threat we have yet to fully subdue. After the last incursions from the Bone Kingdom, the Messar, our chief librarian, has devised a new protocol to counteract this threat. We call it Protocol Presignato." She paused, thinking for a moment. "Presignato? Forewarning," she repeated. He nodded. "We cannot know where this fleet will strike next, so we spread our reserve numbers. If the reserve fleet arrives on a world under our vigilance, our numbers will not be enough to defend it, but will be enough to enact the protocol." "Which is?" Lucia felt a growing chill creep through her. "An astropathic cry to all the nearby systems," he replied, pausing, his face souring in an expression that Lucia could almost recognize to be regret, or whatever paused for such to his kind, and the deployment of an atomic device into the population center currently suffering the attention of the tithing fleet's ground forces. As the gravity of his words set in, Lucia was unable to respond. With the majority of these ground forces positioned for the harvest, it will greatly weaken their numbers, he replied, reading the horror on Lucia's face. It will destroy the city and the Xenos infesting it. Moldavar, Lucia managed. Look around you, sister. Moldavar is already dead. She could see the truth. Death was everywhere, and the sounds of fighting were all but gone. She could believe that her group was the only life left in the city. The bomb. Where is it? In our Thunderhawk, he replied, confirming her suspicion. And it survived the crash? It did. The life signs of the tech marine Huraken persisted until well after the landing. The Thunderhawk is damaged, but it landed successfully. The bomb is intact and ready for priming. Then why did you abandon it? Not by choice, he growled. As I said, the Xenofighter disintegrated a portion of our vessel's hull. 3 of my brothers died, and we were swept out of the hold. Shaking her head in resignation, she finally understood what was coming. Then why bring us? Why drag my people along to their doom? He did not answer immediately. Because we will be descending into the slaughterhouse. The Xenos there are in force, and before you reach the device to activate its self-detonation sequence, we will be swarmed. Each body will be an obstacle. Everyone in the path of the Xenos will be a distraction to their madness. If we were 5, we would be overwhelmed, and our chances of success would be minimal. With greater numbers, we may be able to reach the gunship and activate the device inside. Lucia's eyes widened with horror and disgust as she understood the depth of the Space Marine's deception. You mean to buy time with our blood? Yes. They walked on in silence for several more minutes, and Lucia shook her head, unwilling to accept Neverkarian's words. He slowed to match her pace, evidently aware of her anguish. Lucia had sworn to protect these people, both in taking her oath to the Order of the Ebon Chalice, and when the invasion began. Now the duty seemed to require her to sacrifice all those who had come to her for protection. She had promised them salvation, and all she had brought them was gruesome end in the name of the greater Imperium. The sister realized that even if she attempted to make for the countryside now, they could not survive. Almost a third of the survivors were already dead, and that was under the protection of the Space Marines. What chance did they have without them? Even if they did survive, the probability of outrunning the atomic blast, should the Death Spectres succeed without her, was negligible. A life given onto the anvil of his holy work is a life brought to the Emperor's side in death. She managed. The scriptures given her courage. What to do was necessary. It brings me no pleasure to have deceived you in this manner. I know, she answered, acknowledging the sacrifice of honor that the Space Marines had made in this deception. She realized she would sacrifice her own and her vows to uphold the lie. We are beings of honor, he said, looking directly at her. His face sorrowed in a manner even she could see. This trickery is anathema to our code, but it was necessary until we knew the strength of your resolve. There was almost an admiration in his voice, and were it not for the circumstances, Lucia would have felt bolstered by that praise. Instead, she felt only despair. She understood the burden the Death Spectres carried, and understood why the others could never be told. With that terrible knowledge, she hardened her heart to what was coming. There will be no rescue this time. Those who give their lives unto his service shall meet again by his side, she muttered to herself as she took the position among the survivors again. With grim determination, she continued leading the refugees along in their solemn death march, accepting that the only salvation they would find would be by the Emperor's side. The silence continued for another 2 hours, into the pre-dawn hours, made all the more terrible by the secret she carried. The wan purple glow of Moldoval's last dawn began to seep between the high buttress structures of the city's central district. The Xeno aircraft were gone, and even the corpse piles became more infrequent, although blood spatters still coated many of the alley walls and pools of congealed gore marred the cobble streets. And yet the stench of death and viscera only seemed to grow. A foul hint steadily grew to an unbearable choke in miasma. When the band finally reached the ecclesiarchal plaza at Moldoval's heart, they learned why. Emerging from a wide street, the coughing, almost suffocating refugees followed the Space Marines and Lucia to the edge of the great plaza of Saint Cybele. And they beheld its horror. What was once a space of devotional fervour was now a mass grave on a scale Lucia could barely comprehend. 1/4 mile wide and 1/2 mile long, the plaza had brimmed with tens of thousands each day, gathering for the holy ministrations of the ecclesiarchy. Now it was dotted with the remains of slaughter so absolute that Lucia's resolve threatened to shatter. The pontiff's palace, far to the left, once a gilded cathedral of the emperor's splendor, was a burning remnant of its former self. All 6 spires lay toppled, and its crumbling architecture revealed the skeletal flamework of its innards, an inferno rolling within. The beautiful statue of Saint Cybele, standing at the heart of the plaza's vast fountain, winged and white, was now a tattered angel clad in rags of flayed flesh. The true horror lay scattered across the vastness of the plaza's flagstone surface. The flanced remains of most of the city's population were strewn across it. A grisly mantle of stinking red that blanketed the entire cityscape from the pontiff's palace all the way to the boulevard of the Saints, nearly 1/2 mile away. Amidst the carnage were the hulked remains of dozens of local militia and Arbiti's vehicles, as well as entire swathe of Civity's ground cars and ecclesiarchy transports. Lucia stood, mouth agape, as she took in the horror. For that moment, the sobbing of the miserable survivors stopped. Everyone, even the death spectres, was stunned by the scale of the atrocity before them. She saw the flesh-clad things stalking about the plaza, picking over the dead, dragging them about, seemingly at random, but there was intent, purpose in their erratic movements. Rows of corpses were stacked in walls, and channels were carved out the viscera. It was as if the entire landscape of carnage was being sculpted into a particular shape or form. Lucia blinked the growing image away in her mind and did not dare analyze it further for the sake of her own sanity. Thankfully, most of the refugees were staring upwards, gawking at the massive Xeno vessels hanging in low orbit. It was suspended directly overhead, at least 3 miles long and elongated, insectile in its form. Its stretched abdominal stern, thoracic wings, and reversed crescent prow were illuminated in a faint column of emerald light that shone down from it onto the plaza below. Lucia didn't know how long they stood there, transfixed by the nightmarescape, slowly warming its way into their minds. The Vicarian, standing helmetless beside her, was the first to speak. "We need to move." "Where?" she managed, after a moment of gathering herself. He pointed towards one of the many accumulations of wrecked vehicles in the plaza, and Lucia saw what he was showing her. The sturdy hull of a midnight black Thunderhawk lay at the heart of the carnage, not 300 feet from the grotesquely defiled statue of Saint Cybele. "We make our final push," he said before turning to his warriors. "Brothers, the Black River calls us again, and we will rise to meet it. You know our purpose. Let nothing stand before it." The Death Spectres did not respond. Their silence was all the affirmation Nevicarian needed. Lucia turned to her flock. She did not know what to say to them. Any words of encouragement would be hollow. All those horrified faces, men, women, and children, she had promised them salvation. Where had she led them? She almost couldn't look at them, and she certainly couldn't meet Sarah's gaze. Facing down Xeno abominations was one thing, and talking down a space marine something else entirely. But standing before her ragged band of survivors, knowing what she knew, was far harder. She opened her mouth to speak, and the words finally came. That, she pointed at the Thunderhawk, that is our salvation. She swallowed the lie, however bitter it tasted. The Emperor's angels of death will guide us there, across this horror. Stay together and stay strong in faith. Do not let panic overcome you, and do not become separated. Nevercarian's vox grills crackled as he spoke. The Xenos might appear to be spread out, but they are able to move unseen amongst the dead. Be ever on your guard and keep pace. We will not wait. Lucia exhaled, steeling herself, glancing at last at Sarah. Unexpectedly, the girl seemed to have regained some of her composure, and somehow that made it all the worse. Taking in a deep breath, Lucia spoke, hoping she might bring some bravery to those around her, hoping that through her words they might find some consolation before death claimed them. In the face of death, one can only stare into it with valor and zeal. The darkness of the unknown stands in our way, and the candles of courage within our hearts must be lit to burn as bright as bonfires to stave off darkness. We go in the wake of beings who can know no fear, so let us march alongside them, alongside the Emperor's angels of death, and meet whatever fate awaits. Let that courage burn so bright that the Emperor himself will take notice and bring us forever to his side. Should we fall? Most of the survivors still looked hesitant and broken, if not downright terrified, but some seemed more determined. Raoul took up position alongside the sister, his face as stern and unfazed as those of the death spectres, his shotgun levelled in the direction of the scarecrow horrors stalking the visceral wasteland. The enforcer nodded. Well, this is it then. They were 2/3 of the way across the plaza before the first Xenos noticed them. They'd stumbled in a half-run through the nightmare landscape, winding between hills of flayed bodies and through the ravines of mutilated remains. Their resolve plummeted like sand falling through an hourglass, and were it not for the ever-nearing shape of the massive gunship ahead, she knew the courage of the survivors would have already shattered. Several slipped and fell in their haste. Some of those did not rise again, overcome by fits of maddening sobs, and Lucia could do nothing to draw them back on their feet. She took Sarah by the hand, realizing she could not help everyone, but she would do everything in her power to ensure that the girl's end would be a quick one. A scream bade her to turn around. One of the creatures seemed to materialize from the congealed gore behind a fallen man and impaled him with both its talons, pulling him apart in a shower of blood. Still running, she let go of Sarah and fired her bolter from the hip, blasting the Xeno horror back into the charnel pile from which it emerged. She didn't bother checking whether or not it had truly dead. The death spectres did not stop, merely turning and seeing that the threat was already dealt with. Lucia grabbed a woman who stood transfixed by horror, her foot momentarily stuck in the flensed chest cavity of one of the many dead they had trodden across, and dragged her along before turning back to Sarah. The girl began to fire with her auto pistol at cadaverous shape rising from the pile of gore, the panic in her eyes mixed with a desperate survival instinct. That was when the screaming began in earnest. 3 of the things erupted from hills ahead of them and closed in on the ragged band. 2 fell to carefully aimed bursts from the Space Marines' weapons, but a third cut through 3 of the survivors, descending upon them with a frenzied abandon, flaying them in an instant. Lucia and the militia brought it down with the focused fire of the las and stub pistols and kept running to follow the massive strides of the transhuman giants. The Thunderhawk was so close, its lower hull gouged open. "Forward!" Lucia yelled, letting her rage and disgust boil over, the cloying touch of horror clawing at her mind. More shambling scarecrow shapes erupted from the mountains of dead and began to stalk towards them in great number. Death was coming for them now, and there would be no escape. "Fear not death, we who embody it, in his name!" Nevicarin shouted, his voice a hollow machine rasp beneath his helmet, unleashing his full gene-enhanced fury upon the closest of the Xenos. His warriors did likewise, all the while advancing towards their objective. As more of the horrors began ripping their way from the viscera around the Thunderhawk, two of the Death Spectres activated their jump packs and rocketed towards them, shoulder slamming into the Xenos to send them sprawling before descending upon them with their chainswords. Two strode to meet Nevicarin, driving in from the left flank. He ended one with an incandescent fire of his plasma pistol and bisected the other with his axe. Two more intercepted the trio of stragglers from Lucia's band, ending them in seconds and ravenously descending upon their fallen forms. Lucia, Raoul, and what remained of the survivors followed in his wake, the pain of the sister's wounds and her fatigue lost in the adrenaline flood. More of the horrors closed in all around them as they reached the gunship. The first two Space Marines, having rocketed ahead, had already reached it and easily slipped inside the massive tear in its hull. A deafening bang turned Lucia around, and she saw one of the Space Marines die. It was not something she'd ever expected to see, and it almost halted her in her tracks. The rearguard fell to the stalking horde that was not 20 paces behind them, detonating all of his grenades as one of the three flayed terrors dragged him away into the gore. Empress mercy, she said to herself as she turned, seeing Nevicarin and the Enforcer reach the hull of the Thunderhawk. The former wheeled around and lobbed a grenade over her head, which exploded with a deafening crump, the shockwave knocking her forward. The Enforcer caught her and dragged her into the entrance of the craft before pulling Sarah in two. Everyone behind her had already been claimed by the tide of death that followed them. It was then that she saw how few people had survived. Less than a dozen were crowded in the hull, the rest having distracted the ravaging horrors outside with their lives. She hadn't ever seen most of them fall, but heard several more screams echo from outside into the scorched hold. Two of the Death Spectres held the door, and she had already heard the screeching of the chainswords, the thunder of their bolt pistols, and the grating, dead static howls of the nightmares they held at bay. The insanity of their suicidal charge shifted into the muted despair of what was coming. The gloom of the Thunderhawk's claustrophobic hold pressed upon them. Lucia pulled a gasping and likely concussed Sarah to her feet as the stablites from the few remaining militias and the Enforcer began to crisscross through the hold. Two of the Death Spectres were already unlatching a sturdy crate from a compartment near the prow. One Space Marine helmet was sheared off, his bleached features ragged by 3 dread slashes. Nevicarin and the remaining Space Marine barred the entrance with a black armoured bulk, and Lucia saw them hacking at the horde of taloned horrors outside, their revving chainsword and the heavy pistol keeping the Xenos at bay. "Hurricane!" Nevicarin shouted over the din. "Dead, but his duty is done," their helmetless Space Marine returned. "It is active! Prestignatio is active!" The two Death Spectres set the heavy crate down and opened it, reverently removing the atomic device within. It was a cylindrical thing covered in a thick gunmetal chasing emblazoned with the skull and cog of the Adeptus Mechanicus. A meter long and covered in hazard stripes, flashing red warning runes, and thick cables. There was very little disguising it what it could be. A faint hum echoed through the chamber. The survivors gawked at it, either not knowing what it was or perhaps realizing its deadly intent, and finally coming to the conclusion what was to come. From one knee, Lucia breathed a benediction. "Let your light lead us to your side at the eternal throne." Nevicarin kicked away the creature he fought and blasted it with an incandescent burst of his plasma pistol. "The gunship!" the sergeant called to the wounded Death Spectre, his voice a crackle through his vox grill. "Still operable," he responded. Lucia wasn't sure if she'd heard correctly. Nevicarin glanced at his sister and turned back to his warrior. "Then pilot the craft out of here. Get these souls to the mountains. Keep them from the Black River for one more day. Find a way off this world and give word of our endings to the Throne of Glass." The Space Marine paused, and Lucia guessed he might be disappointed in being denied the chance to die along his brothers. But then he nodded grimly. "I will carry out the task, my lord." "Good. Then you have 3 minutes to me leave this place." Nevercarian stepped back, letting the other Death Spectre hold the door to assist the one carrying the bomb. "We will bestow the gift of oblivion upon these Xenos. Walk once more from the Black River's banks. Now is not your time, brother Varian." Varian neither saluted nor affirmed, but merely regarded Nevercarian and those still outside with his empty black eyes. "Drink deep from its current, brothers." And with that, he strode off towards the cockpit. Lucia watched with disbelief as Nevercarian and the other Space Marines left the hull with the primed atomic device. 3 warriors against a tide of death. She saw Enforcer Raoul and made eye contact. "Good run, sister. Maybe we'll meet again at the Emperor's side," he said, a cold smile on his face before he joined the Death Spectres. "Walk at his side," Lucia breathed, tasting blood in her mouth. But he was already gone. Gone to the sound of gunfire, the howling dead static, and the battle cries. Lucia looked to the others, 10 terrified faces, perhaps broken by their experience, but glimmering with a hope she hadn't realized was possible. She looked at Sarah. Dazed as she was, Lucia saw hope aflame in those green eyes, burning away the trauma and the horror. For the first time since the incursion began, Lucia allowed herself a hint of a smile. The gunship's lights flickered on, and its thrusters began to hum, drowning out the sound of the carnage unfolding outside. Varian's voice cut in from the craft's Vox speakers. "Stay away from the hull breach, and hold on to something if you want to live." Lucia seized one of the hanging bars overhead, locking in her knuckles around it in a death grip. She held Sarah's hand in case she fell before she felt the sudden lurch of the Thunderhawk leaving the ground. "The Emperor protects," she breathed, closing her eyes. A deafening roar sounded, and the momentum shifted to the horizontal acceleration as the Thunderhawk surged towards the mountains, towards dawn, towards salvation.